I think we should start this session in this wonderful conference. It was suggested to me that we'll have the 3 talks in a row and then the discussion, because there might be relationships between them. And I can start this session, though, before saying a few words to Rivka. I'm an outsider here, and I'm probably here just because of our long friendship. And I'm really grateful for being here and for being able to say a few words to Rivka at this moment. Our friendship goes back a very long time. We've both been students of Feldhay, who was a wonderful teacher and inspirer, and also the director of this institute, which became a center, not to say a shrine, of the history and philosophy of science in Israel. And I think we share this gratitude to Feldhay, who passed away not so long ago. Since Feldhay had such broad interests, Rivka and I could choose different aspects of his teaching to concentrate on. And I became a philosopher interested in the history of science, and Rivka became the leading historian of science that we all know. But this parting of the way didn't stop us from maintaining a very long and warm friendship, not the kind of friendship that you express every day or not even every week, but the kind of friendship that I think we all know and cherish, that you're friends with someone and you cannot see him for 3 years, say, and then you meet and it's if you've never interrupted the conversation, and you go back to a mixture of personal and intellectual topics in a very natural and candid way. And this is the kind of conversation Rivka and I had. We were also together in a wonderful sabbatical year in Stanford, struggling with a new personal computer. Rivka is always taking the hard way, as we earned today, and she had to master it immediately, and I was lagging behind. But then we had little children, and so we had common problems of different devotions at that time, and later being women scientists in a male society. I don't think it was so hard, but we had some problematic experiences sometimes. And we shared moments of joy and moments of sorrow over the years. And I'm very grateful to you, Rivka, for your friendship over the years. And I think retirement is for my experience with retirement, is a wonderful thing in the sense that on the one hand, you can let go a little bit and let the world turn without you, as they say. And on the other hand, you have much more control over your time and can do all the things you want to continue to do, and that I'm sure you will continue to do. So, כל הברכות שבעולם. And it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Moritz Epple from the University of Frankfurt, or Goethe University of Frankfurt, who is a historian of modern, a professor of modern history, and works on the history of modern mathematics. In particular, a book he published in German about the context and construction in knot theory, as a case study in context and construction in modern mathematics in general, is being translated now into English. So for those of us who are not fluent in German, we will have a chance to read it. And he's also familiar to us from the wonderful exhibition on Jewish mathematicians in German-speaking culture, which also visited Israel and won the prize of the German Academia. And he will speak to us today about inequality, borders, and the alliance of the learned and the great, untimely reflections, you have it over there, of an encyclopedist. Please.
Many thanks for this introduction, and I have to introduce my talk with a remark that I'm deeply honored to be part of this conference in honor of Rivka Feldhay. I am not one of the very old friends and co-workers of Rivka since decades, like so many here. We, of course, know each other as intellectual authors in a way, but as persons we encountered not so long ago in a fairly special event here in Tel Aviv, well, not here in Jerusalem, but over there in Tel Aviv, in an exchange of doctoral students from Frankfurt and Tel Aviv University and a few other places in Israel, an exchange of young scholars that is also part of this conference, as it turns out. Some of the young people are with us here. And this intellectual exchange that started there has also brought us together in Frankfurt and also opened a kind of exchange and intellectual relation that I very much hope will continue in the future. And as I said, I feel deeply honored to be here with you in this conference. We share a common interest in the complex relations between science, scientists, and other areas of culture and society. And I want to speak here about an ongoing project of translation, a translation of a text that concerns in several senses the making of modernity. Since several years, I have been engaged with a small group in Frankfurt in translating Jean d'Alembert's major philosophical text, the Essai sur les éléments de philosophie of 1759, into German. Our effort is the first since Johann Maria Weizsäcker had a first go at a partial translation of this text in 1787, a dated translation of which very few copies survive and that was rarely used by German scholars. Only recently it has been digitized on our initiative. You can read it on the web now. So much for the migration of knowledge between France and Germany in the last 3 centuries. Our interest in this text stems not least from the wish to understand the role of mathematical thought in culture and in politics. And while d'Alembert would have loved to comment on the last talk, and I think he would have had a lot to say on the matters that were touched upon in it, I will here focus on a very different part of d'Alembert's writing. The interest in this text stems not least from the wish to understand the role of a mathematician, the role of mathematical thought in culture and, in fact, in politics. As you will see, not just the migration of knowledge, but the actual migration of people will come to play a role in what follows. Let me begin with 2 quotations from the essay. The first quotation begins as follows. All translations here to the English in the following are mine, and I hope they are half decent. Let us assume 20 million inhabitants in France and 10,000 million of riches. That means about £500 per capita, to which every citizen has equal right. And then the quotation continues. The second quotation reads, make known to the people of Asia, make known to every citizen of Europe, the government under which he will find himself to be freest and happiest, in what concerns his talents, his manners, his character, and his fortune. There will no longer be a fatherland. Everyone will choose his own. In a present that is marked by a striking increase in the inequality of the distribution of wealth, both within many civilized states and even more so globally, and in a present that is characterized by the violent closure of the borders of many of these states and of Europe as a whole, I find these quotations from one of the leading European scientists of the 18th century deeply puzzling for several reasons. The first and major puzzle results from the striking contrast between the normative implications or assumptions of these egalitarian views with the political principles endorsed by the richer countries of our present time. This contrast does not fit easily with another commonplace about modern societies, namely the view that the period in which d'Alembert wrote, and that was and is seen by many as a period of enlightenment, was a cradle of modernity. Or looking the other way, that modernity, here understood as a political and social complex, inherited the principles laid out by Enlightenment thought. There can be no doubt that Jean d'Alembert, excellent mathematician, second main editor of the Grande Encyclopédie with Denis Diderot, member of the Académie des Sciences and the Preußische Akademie der Wissenschaften, permanent secretary of the Académie Française since 1772, was one of the main representatives of enlightened thought, whatever more specific understanding of enlightenment you may prefer. And you will certainly agree that the principles just quoted have radical force. If so, and if indeed modernity inherited its principles, or some of its principles at least, from the Enlightenment, one must wonder what has happened to the principles just quoted. Or should we in the end be more careful with the thesis that modernity inherited the principles of Enlightenment thought? Are we faced here with an example of the plurality of intellectual tendencies that ran through early modern Europe and that bears a much more complex relationship with the period we call modern, in the sense that it's the period we are in, than is sometimes assumed? The second puzzle concerns the formation of the views I just quoted. What brought a geometer in the middle of the 18th century to articulating such principles? As we will see, these views were not accidental remarks, but principled beliefs in the framework of what this author understood to be a moral science. D'Alembert, in a striking way, pursued a career between the sciences, the sciences, in the French of the time, and the lettres. In his Esquisse d'un tableau historique des progrès de l'esprit humain, Condorcet would discuss progress both in science and morals. In the essay sur les éléments de philosophie, d'Alembert sought to combine the two in a certain way, as I want to show. A third puzzle arises from the very content of the quotations. What exactly does the little calculation in the first quotation mean? What was its intellectual context? What are the details of an analysis of wealth and social structure that are implied? Note that in d'Alembert's little calculation, 10,000 million divided by 20 million equals to about 500, which for a mathematician is a little surprising. And also note, of course, that the quote continues. For the second quotation, why did d'Alembert address Asians and Europeans, and how is his prediction to be understood that fatherlands, but perhaps not governments, will cease to exist? How is this, by the way, related to another commonplace we have been accustomed to about the period in which d'Alembert wrote, namely the idea that Enlightenment thought is deeply intertwined with Eurocentrism? The answers to these questions are not obvious and require some care. Let us have a closer look at these three puzzles, beginning with the last. In the chapter of his essay titled Morale de l'homme, d'Alembert treated the duties of human beings against each other, if they were only considered as human beings living in a society. Other branches dealt with the duties of a ruled society or state to its members, morale des législateurs, the duties of states against each other, morale des États, and the duties of the members of a state to each other and to the state, morale des citoyens. The morale de l'homme concerned with both the written and unwritten natural laws of humans living together, and the central task of the unwritten laws or virtues of social life was, for d'Alembert, the securing of the well-being of individuals. Not regarding them would be a slowly acting poison which will undermine and dissolve society. To secure the well-being of the members of society included more than just the removal of poverty. Strictly speaking, the well-being of an individual included every contribution to the satisfaction of its needs, and d'Alembert concluded to sacrifice one's own well-being to the needs of others is the great principle of all social virtues and the remedy for all passions. To spell out this principle, d'Alembert relied on a number of considerations about the tasks of a state going beyond a simple system of taxation for covering administrative expenses and asking for an actual redistribution of wealth. To this end, d'Alembert, being a mathematician as well as a moral philosopher, introduced two measures of physical wealth, the absolutely necessary and the relatively necessary. By definition, the measure of the absolutely necessary wealth had to secure the healthy survival of an individual. Consequently, this measure was not perfectly equal for all individuals, but dependent on age, family status, health, education, gender, just to mention a few of the factors he names. The measure of relatively necessary wealth, on the other hand, should secure a life according to status and circumstances, meaning professional life. The best rule for fixing the relative measure of wealth for a given profession, according to d'Alembert, was public opinion. In particular, this meant that any professional income needed public legitimacy. Now, the guiding rule for the distribution of wealth in a society was simply that every individual would receive the relative measure of wealth according to her or his circumstances, if, and that was an essential if, the total social wealth did allow to fulfill this rule. If not, then at least the absolutely necessary measure of wealth would need to be granted. D'Alembert was convinced that in his own time, many individuals did not receive the absolutely necessary. In this situation, it was the moral duty of that part of society that owned more than the absolutely necessary to share part of this surplus. A law which precedes any consideration of the relatively necessary is that in all states in which several citizens are lacking the absolutely necessary, and these states are in the majority, all those who have more than this necessary owe to the state at least a part of what they own in surplus. My first initial quotation is in fact the beginning of a lengthy footnote to illustrate this law. In the footnote, which is sort of the most radical core of this whole argument, in this footnote, d'Alembert offered a detailed calculation of how much the state would have to take from the wealthier part in order to help the poorer. Thus, the general right to equal income, quoted at the very beginning, was modified to allow a redistribution of unequal incomes so that the absolutely necessary measure of wealth was granted to everybody. The further argument in the footnote made clear that this was just a first step toward a more far-reaching redistribution of wealth that would be just, and that analogous laws would have to regulate relatively necessary wealth. What d'Alembert offered here was thus a model of the social distribution of wealth with a guaranteed lowest income depending on the needs of individuals, and understood as an unwritten natural law, as a first step towards an even more complex redistribution of wealth within society. Any income that went beyond the relatively necessary wealth of an individual was termed luxury. Luxury is to the relatively necessary as this is to the absolutely necessary, and the moral laws about luxury have to be even more rigorous than those about the relatively necessary. One can reduce them to the serious but true law that luxury is a crime against humanity, when even just one single member of society suffers and one is aware of it. With respect to the issue of moral equality, understood as I have just outlined, d'Alembert was quite a bit more explicit than other encyclopedists, even if several of them shared the same orientation toward an actual redistribution of wealth. Diderot, for instance, included the following passage in his article on Homme, in the subsection Homme politique: the more the total product of society grows and is equally distributed, the better is the administration. An equally distributed total product can be preferred to a larger total product that would be distributed in a very unequal way and would divide people into two classes, of which one would enjoy riches in abundance, whereas the other would expire in misery. The almost mathematical ease with which these considerations were stated was to some extent deceiving. There are obvious problems if D'Alembert's moral laws are to be turned into actual rules of social institutions. The essential problem glossed over was the quantification of wealth. Wealth was not just income, but included other possessions such as land and all kinds of other goods, and in fact, following D'Alembert's argument, everything that relates to the needs of individuals, be they material or immaterial. In other words, D'Alembert's notion of equality relied on an abstraction. He was fully aware of this. It is essential to note that he distinguished the moral equality of individuals from their metaphysical equality, as he called it on that account. While the latter, concrete equality in all respects, would always remain a chimera, and in fact more damaging than helpful in social matters, the former, moral equality, required to base the application of laws of equality on a procedure abstracting the essential features of wealth from the concrete variety of goods in the possession of individuals. Quite obviously, such a procedure would require experts, knowledge, and a complex administrative structure in order to function effectively in a state. D'Alembert's essay, one looks in vain for details on this point. He was very clear, however, that it required to turn morals into a science, to which I will return in a minute. A second problem with D'Alembert's morals of equality arises from the tension it leaves between the opening move of sketching a morale de l'homme and distinguishing from a morale du citoyen, while giving its laws in a form that require a state to take care for their observation. For D'Alembert, it was evident that there was a plurality of states. So, do the unwritten laws of morals end at the borders of a state? When our translation group moved into this territory, I expected this problem to reveal the implicit Franco or Eurocentrism of our enlightened author. And in a certain sense it does, but not quite in the way I initially assumed. Indeed, it would be wrong to suspect that the universalist claims of the Encyclopedist's morals of equality hided a particularist conception that only claimed validity within some European État policé and left the rest of the globe to itself. A closer reading of both the Encyclopédie and of D'Alembert's essay reveals that an explicit assumption in its conception of morals was the existence of open borders, or the possibility of a free migration of individuals between states. One of the articles in the Encyclopédie dealing with this issue is the entry étranger, foreigner, in the 6th volume. In a typical encyclopedic manner, Louis de Jaucourt, the author of the entry and in fact the most prolific writer of the Encyclopédie of all, approached the delicate topic by means of a detour through anecdotes about the ancient world, and after presenting various barbaric customs of prosecuting foreigners, Jaucourt presented an ancient hero, and I quote, I don't think I have this quote here. In contrast, Alexander never proved more worthy of the name the Great than when he made to declare in an edict that all humans are each other's relatives, and that only the vicious should be considered foreigners. Jaucourt then spelled out what this meant in his own times. Today, when the commerce links the whole universe, when politics is enlightened about its interest, when humanity extends to all people, one no longer poses the question whether laborious and industrious foreigners should be allowed to settle in our country while subjecting them to its laws. No one ignores that nothing contributes more to the greatness, the power, and the wealth of a state than the free access it offers to foreigners to come and establish themselves, and the care which it takes to attract them and to fix them with all the proper means to be successful. Not only where immigrants welcome, a good state should attract them. D'Alembert's essay contained very similar considerations, linked with his conception of morals. The crucial idea was that of a right to choose the state to live in. And again, a longish quote, not only owes a citizen his life to human society, he also owes his talents to the society he happens to be in or which he has chosen. We say that he has chosen, since in all governments that are not absolute tyrannies, every member of the state is free to renounce his fatherland for choosing a new one, as soon as he finds his condition to be too onerous. The attachments of humans to their country, so natural and general, is based on the happiness they enjoy or on the uncertainty to find themselves in better circumstances elsewhere. Make known to the people of Asia, and so forth, and then comes the quotation that I used to open this talk. Make known to the people of Asia, the moderate governments of Europe and the despots of Asia will soon be abandoned by their subjects. Make known to every citizen of Europe, and so forth. D'Alembert's consideration here again relies on a number of presuppositions, not all of which are harmless. It points to an aspect of the global distribution of knowledge. What do people know about the circumstances of living in another country? And we may add, of getting there. And it points to the material difficulties of actual migration. But now we can also see more precisely the place where Eurocentrism and the classical cliché of Oriental despotism resided in this text, not in keeping Europe's borders shut, but in the idea that no other place in the world might be worth living in. Still, even taking this into consideration, what a striking contrast to present-day realities. Before leaving this topic, I want to return to the question whether D'Alembert's vision was one of a globally homogeneous society and culture. It was not, in fact. Just as abstract moral equality was opposed to concrete, metaphysical concrete differences, and the notion of metaphysical equality, which he despised, D'Alembert appreciated the differences between countries and languages. The place to look for in his writings are his reflections on languages and on translation in particular. Being a prominent translator of Tacitus' Germania himself, clearly a republican effort in absolutist France, his observations on the art of translating, prefixed to his pieces of Tacitus since 1759, the translation itself had appeared a few years earlier, offer an interesting argument on cultural variety. In D'Alembert's view, the characters of languages differed in their ability and means to express ideas. Against this background, he asked what balance a translation should strike between expressing ideas in the language of the original and the language of translation. There were two opposing possibilities to fail. Imposing too strongly the expressive constraints of her own language, a translator would miss the originality and different perspective of a foreign author. Trying, on the other hand, to follow the foreign style too slavishly while breaking with the conventions of her own language, the translator would fail to translate at all because he wouldn't be or she wouldn't be understood. How then should one translate? And again, one of these quotes. Sometimes one finds oneself, D'Alembert wrote, with foreigners of much esprit, who speak our language with ease and boldness. In conversation they think in their language and translate into ours. And we often regret that the energetic and singular terms they use are not authorized by customary usage. The conversation of these foreigners, assuming it is correct, is the model of a good translation. The persona of the migrant was thus the model for the art of translation and the key to an appreciation of the interaction between different languages and countries. Why was a geometer the author of a well-received contribution to the mathematical sciences, such as the Traité de Dynamique of 1743 and the Traité sur les mouvements des fluides of 1744, interested in moral issues like these? The superficial and easy answer would be to refer to D'Alembert's role in the encyclopedic project. Being one of its main editors and gaining wide acknowledgement as the author of its Discours préliminaire, he was certainly drawn to engage with intellectual matters beyond his mathematical abilities. After his rift with Diderot in the turmoil following the publication of volume 7 of the Encyclopédie in 1757, which I will not go into here, D'Alembert continued to elaborate his general perspective on knowledge and its role for society, and the essay that we are translating clearly testifies to that. But there is a more intrinsic and less obvious connection between D'Alembert's agenda in the mathematical sciences and his views on moral equality. This connection relied on his beliefs about the epistemology of both domains. It was clear to him that gaining insight into the unwritten laws of nature, about social matters, was part, and in fact the essential part, of a moral science. Its tasks included as one of its principal points to determine the limits of the absolutely necessary and of the relatively necessary, as I've just explained. And given that both these measures of well-being were dependent on circumstances, the task was complex and required the availability of exact data, another term of this crucial footnote, and a social calculus that only a proper science could deliver. Even if the assessment of the needs and the wealth of individuals would require a detailed consideration of individual circumstances, this science, based on, and I quote, what belongs essentially and uniquely to reason, would be strictly universal and, I quote again, uniform in all peoples. However, D'Alembert deplored that, in, quote again, in our schools this science, I have not given it here, in our schools this science is not given much honor. It is relegated to the end of all other parts of philosophy and reduced to throwing up a few empty and scholastic questions. Despite this neglect, moral science had a special status. And I quote again, few sciences have a more wide-ranging object and principles more susceptible of convincing proofs. In other words, moral science occupied a similarly universal and epistemologically robust place in knowledge about human affairs as the mathematical sciences had in knowledge about the natural world. This epistemological parallelism is essential in D'Alembert's essay and is shared by some later authors close to him, such as Condorcet. I don't have the time to go into this and to explain this in detail, but I have tried to summarize this parallelism on this table. I want specifically to point to the fact that the basis, the starting point of the science is the perception of something bad, and as opposed to certain theorists of the natural state, like Hobbes and so forth, this is a perception of the present. It's an actual perception of the bad state and shape of the present of the scientists interested in this science morale. To conclude, let me return to the first puzzle. What is the politics here? And the relation to the paths to modernity? How did D'Alembert, as an intellectual, as a member of an academic elite, position himself in the conflicts that were the unavoidable consequence of the bad state of his own present, of the inequalities he described, or of the social changes we could add brought about by migration? Whom did he choose as his allies? Whom did he try to convince or to help with his arguments with the fruits of his intellectual labor? Of course, we also have to ask these very same questions about ourselves in our own world of inequalities and of social change. At the beginning of my talk, I referred to the standard view of a straightforward relation between progressive Enlightenment thought and modernity, as recently outlined once again, for instance, by Jonathan Israel in his massive books. But as we have seen, the ideas presented in D'Alembert's essay bear no simple relation with the realities of later nation states. Modernity has definitely not followed the more radical project of a morals of equality, and the borders of most states, of most modern states, remain shut. This contrast or distance of a position from where D'Alembert spoke to the realities of the society requires explanation. For a last time, let us revert to D'Alembert, homme de lettres. His own career was marked by a number of distancing moves. He rejected the invitation to join Frederick the Great at the Prussian Academy of the Sciences. He pulled out of the Encyclopédie project when it got him involved into official politics too much. And indeed, he defended the independence of an intellectual in the sharp essay, which is much more critical of the gens de lettres than is often assumed. This essay, first published in 1753, is usually referred to in modern literature, and it's read by many people, especially in literary studies, with the abbreviated title Essai sur la société des gens de lettres, and taken to be an early statement of the autonomy of the modern intellectual in society. But again, this reading is in danger of simplification. It is telling to give the full title of this text, in translation, Essay on the Alliance of the gens de lettres and the Great, on reputation and patrons, and on literary recompenses. Indeed, the essay contained a scathing critique of intellectuals making deals with the rich and powerful, be it with aristocrats who hoped to catch some rays of intellectual brilliance from the scientists and writers whom they patronized, or be it with the publishers who earned fortunes from the intellectual work of others. Thus, yes, the text was a plea for intellectual independence, but an independence that would only remain guaranteed if the homme de lettres adhered to what D'Alembert saw as his essential values: liberty, truth, and poverty. Thus, we are left with another tension in D'Alembert's writing. On the one hand, he proposed principles for improving the state and the elaboration of a moral science that would potentially require a whole army of experts. On the other hand, he pleaded for keeping a distance to the structure of power and wealth as an intellectual. Here, one of the notions of the young Karl Mannheim seems to be particularly fitting. In his Problems on the Sociology of Knowledge of 1925, Mannheim characterized knowledge of the Enlightenment period as an Oppositionswissenschaft, an oppositional science, and at least in the context of D'Alembert's own present, the Ancien Régime, D'Alembert's science can indeed be said to have been oppositional in a rather clear sense. It was intended to improve the condition of those who lacked the necessary for their well-being, and in a precise sense to attack the crime of luxury of those who had more than that. What became of the complex of ideas he presented in the French Revolution and in the modern nation-state, on the other hand, is not clear. Both the radical republican option of the Jacobins and the more moderate option of advocates of the Napoleonic state, and perhaps even a third option based on a kind of public science of social well-being, seem to be compatible with at least parts of D'Alembert's conception of a science morale. Indeed, there are several indications that D'Alembert was not having in mind a state bureaucracy of experts on moral equality, but rather viewed moral science as a task to be taken care of by the enlightened public. Among them is not just the idea already cited that the safest rule for determining relatively necessary wealth is the public opinion, but also several hints that the assessment of the portion of social wealth needs to be redistributed from the richer to the poorer part of society is, and I quote for a last time, a calculus that every citizen is obliged to make. Be that as it may, D'Alembert was right in one point at least. The issue of equality within a ruled society and the opening of the borders of the social units we have to come to call states remains an issue of morals. Radically conceived, we are faced here with an element of at least some strands of enlightened thought that was dropped on our path to modernity. To highlight this issue, oppositional science is needed today as it was then.